Okay. So, hello everyone. It's now 12:30 UK time and 1:30 in Europe, where most of the members of this panel are based. Well, in fact, all of us are based. And I'd like to wish you a very warm welcome to the webinar. We're first of all going to wait for people to join us. And as you are joining us, can I ask you to let us know on the chat that you're here, that you've logged in and joined the webinar on interpreting in a post-COVID era. So just use the chat function, which I'm sure you're familiar with, to let us know who you are, where you've come from, where you're joining from, and we will then be able to begin the webinar. So that's the first step to take. And shortly, when we start, I will introduce the panel of 3 professional interpreters from the European Union, and we'll be discussing the subject of interpreting in the post-COVID era. I shall start by wishing you all welcome on the chat as well. So I hope to get you started, break the ice, and invite you all to tell us who you are and where you are. And then very shortly, I will be introducing the panel. Well, hello, Maria. Maria's joined. Thank you for joining us. You live in London, so we look forward to discussing with you later on. That's great. And Simon, hi. That's great. So you're working as an interpreter. That's fantastic. Ellen, hi. That's great. Also from London. And Simon's joining from Wales. Borodar, I can manage that. I'm not quite sure about Porb, but no doubt you'll correct me. Studying interpreting and law. Very interesting. So that's good. We're getting some people joining in the chat. So if you have just joined us, please do tell us in the chat your name, where you're joining from, and anything else you want to tell us about you. And here is Zainab Nihat from Birmingham, and Rita as well, coming from Spain. Or you come from Spain, but originally from Italy. Portuguese. We have Maria Amaral, and it's very good to welcome you also to the webinar, Maria. That's excellent. So I'm going to give it a few more seconds for people to join and to let us know that you're out there. We are all here looking forward to telling you about what goes on in the institutions, but also discussing and answering your questions about this subject. And Lois is from Lancashire and joining us from Lancashire anyway. That's great. You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be giving this webinar and to be able to discuss all these relevant issues for all those of us who love languages. So we have quite a few people already joining us, and more are coming in all the time, which is really fantastic. And also, I would like to know if you've been to any other webinars so far in this show. So do tell us about that too. Did you go to the other EU one on becoming an interpreter? Because if you didn't manage to catch that, you can join and watch it as a recording later on, which is a fantastic feature of this show. And that's even better than being live, isn't it, really? Although I'm reluctant to admit that anything can be better than actually meeting in person. But I have to say that being able to listen to something that's been recorded that you missed is a really good feature. So those are our main people who have been very, very quick off the mark and written in to tell us who they are. I think in a few moments then we will start, and we're going to start with a couple of questions that we'd like to ask you, a little poll. My name's Catherine Smart, as you can see, I think, and I'm a staff interpreter at the Court of Justice of the EU, which is based in Luxembourg. And we have panelists today. I'm going to be moderating the webinar. We have panelists from all three institutions which have interpreting services in the EU. So we have someone from the European Commission and Council Interpreting Service, and that's Jennifer Taylor. We have Ruben Imre, who's from the European Parliament's Interpreting Service, and we have Predrag Latinovic, who is from the Court of Justice Interpreting Service. So I think if the panelists agree, it might be a good moment for us to start with the poll that we've prepared for you, for all the participants. And we'd love to find out a bit more about you. You see, we're very curious. And because we can't actually see you or talk to you, we've dreamed up a few questions for you to answer. So if you agree, then we'll do that. And perhaps before I start the poll, I would just ask you, it's great to hear from you in the chat, but throughout the webinar, if you have questions, please use the Q&A, the question and answer function on this platform, because then we can see the questions very quickly. It's easier for me to see them in between comments and other chat points that you might be making. So if you want your question to be answered, please put it in the Q&A. That would be great. So now let's have a look at our poll for today. So I've got to relaunch poll. Here we are. No, end poll, got to end that poll, got the wrong one. So, sorry about that slight change there. So can you all see, can the panelists see question 1? Yes, you can, that's good. So here's question 1. So have a look at that. Oh, I see, that was a very quick answer, thank you. So we've got already 50% of the group are students of languages, translation and/or interpretation. That's just gone down a bit, actually. So someone's changed their mind. Some of you are languages, translation or interpretation graduates, but not currently working as interpreters. And so far, 10% of you are working as interpreters. So that's very, very interesting for us to know. Thank you very much. Let me just leave that there for another few moments in case anyone else is joining us and wants to ask, wants to join in and answer the questions. Okay, so if everyone is okay with that, I shall go on to the next question. So that's given us a final result of 43% of participants are graduates of languages or translation or interpreting studies, but not currently working as an interpreter. And 29% are students of languages, while 7% are working as interpreters. That's the end of question 1. So let me go on to question 2 in our quick poll. And there are only 3 questions, so it's really a walk in the park. Here's question 2 then. So this is about your working environment. So we look forward to your answers on that. I think this must be a more thought-provoking question because
I can't actually see it at the moment, Catherine.
Can't
that
you?
might just be me.
That could be because I need to. Oh, you can't either. Okay, I've just had a message as well to say, I think this is what we have to do each time is relaunch. Can you see it now? Great.
Yes.
Thank you for pointing that out. And thank you, Lois, as well. So, okay. Right, so we have a lot of answers already. We have most people saying they don't work as interpreters at the moment, 85%, but 15% say they use a mixture of working online from home or in a hub or in person. And I think that's a very interesting result for our panel later on when they come to talk about what we do in the EU and compare our experiences, and also to whether that's changed since before the pandemic or not. So that was a very useful question. Thank you for answering it. So I'm going to end question 2, if I'm not going too fast, I hope, and move on to question 3, which now I'm wise to this and think I might have to. Oh, no, I haven't used that one yet. So I can launch question 3 and hope you can see it. That's great. So question 3 is about the role of technology, which of course we are going to be talking about to some extent. So do you perceive the increasing role of technology as an opportunity, a threat, or are you not sure? I see. So we've got results coming in which show that so far 42% of you see it. Oh no, it's gone up to 46%. It's about half and half then between an opportunity and not sure. And I'm glad to say that only 8% see it as a threat. So that's a very interesting result as well for our panelists to go into more detail on that later on. So roughly speaking, 50% see it as an opportunity and about 10% as a threat, and the remainder are not sure. So thank you very much for joining the poll. I think we can end that now. Share results, let's see. Yeah, we've done that. Stop sharing, sorry. So I'm going to close that now. Thank you very much, all of you, for taking part in that poll. I must say that was my first time doing a poll on Zoom, so I hope I can put that on my CV now as one of my increasing array of tech skills. But that's enough about me, other than to say that I'm joining the panel from Luxembourg, as I said, and I'm a staff interpreter at the Court of Justice of the EU. And I'm going to be moderating the panel today. So as I said, I'm going to put the Q&A on so I can look at all your questions at the same time. And the panelists are going to make sure I don't miss anything important, I hope. So I'm going to first of all, ask our panelists to introduce themselves, because we're all looking forward to hearing where they are working and what they're doing. And I'm going to ask you, Jennifer Taylor, can I ask you first of all to address the webinar and tell us about yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Catherine. Hello, everyone. Good to be back at the London Language Show. My name's Jennifer Taylor, as Catherine has said, and I work in Brussels as an interpreter in the English booth at the European Commission, DG SCIC, that's the Interpretation Directorate General of the European Commission. I've been working as an interpreter for just over 10 years, first as a freelance interpreter on the private market, and then for the institutions for about coming on to 6 years now, first in a freelance capacity, and I've been employed by the European Commission, by SCIC, for about 3 years now. And yeah, perhaps just a couple of words on what the European Commission is. I'm sure people who study law, EU law, or political sciences might find this a little oversimplistic, but the European Commission basically could be equated to an executive branch of the EU if compared to a national government. So it has various policy departments that we call Directorate Generals. Directorate General for Agriculture, for instance, for climate action, mobility and transport, trade, and many, many others. And the task of these Directorate Generals is to propose legislation, EU legislation. They cannot, or the European Commission cannot unilaterally adopt this legislation. It has to be discussed and adopted and voted on by the two co-legislators, the Council and the Parliament. Ruben is here from the Parliament. Of course, I'll speak a little to the Council as well, because in DG SCIC we service not only the European Commission Directorate Generals, but also other institutions here in Brussels, such as the Council of Ministers and also the Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of the Regions. Another role that the European Commission has is to assist member states in the implementation of legislation once it has been adopted, and to monitor how that legislation is being implemented at the national level. And so, as I said, at DG SCIC, where I work, we provide interpretation, but also conference organizing facilities, rooms, technical support for meetings, multilingual and monolingual, organized by the Directorates General of the European Commission, but also the Council of Ministers. and the other two committees, Economic and Social and Committee of the Region. And the meetings we service at SCIC vary enormously. It can be, a small 2-language meeting with just 2 interpreters working bidirectionally, up to a full language regime, which is usually 23 booths. So all the official languages of the European Union, and sometimes non-EU languages as well. So it's very varied, the work we do at SCIC, which is one of the reasons I enjoy it. We work mostly in simultaneous mode. A few meetings happen in consecutive mode as well. And of course, increasingly now, since the onset of COVID, also via remote interpreting platforms. But I think we'll be coming to that more in a minute. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. That's got us off to a really good start, and it's really good to picture and position the institutions and what they all do so that everyone can get a sense of what kind of work is done. And also it's very interesting to learn about how you work, that there's simultaneous, but there's very small meetings, there are much larger meetings, and how varied that is. That's great. So moving on, can I go on to Ruben now, please? Ruben Imre is with us from the European Parliament. Would you like to introduce yourself, Ruben?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Catherine. I'm Ruben. I'm an interpreter in the English booth at the European Parliament, as you mentioned, and I live in Brussels and I work mainly in Brussels, I should say, perhaps. And I've been working as a member of staff at the European Parliament for just over 10 years now. And before that, I was a freelancer working in Brussels as well, but also in Geneva and elsewhere. Now, to tell you a little bit about the European Parliament, just very briefly, the European Parliament is made up of 705 members, MEPs, who are elected in the 27 EU member states. And the European Parliament Interpreting Service essentially exists to help the MEPs fulfill their role as elected representatives, because they are the ones who are directly elected by European citizens. And what that means for interpreters, seeing as this is a panel about interpretation specifically rather than the European Parliament perhaps, is that, as Jennifer said, actually, as Jenny said, there's a massive amount of variety in what we do, both linguistic, because MEPs come from all the EU member states, so that's 23 official languages, and also in terms of subject matter. Members of the European Parliament are involved in crafting negotiation, in negotiating in crafting legislation, rather, in negotiating legislation as well among themselves and with the Commission and with the Council. They're also involved in fact-finding missions, campaigning, obviously, they're politicians, awareness raising, providing information, finding out information. I mean, you name it, they do it, essentially, I think, across all the 705 MEPs. So it's a very fast-paced environment, full of variety. And I mean, in terms of languages, we have the small meetings, as Jenny mentioned, with just 2 languages, with perhaps 2 or 3 participants or more. And we have the big plenary sessions in Strasbourg mainly, but also in Brussels with a full 23 language regime. Now, another feature of working at the European Parliament, which I perhaps suggested earlier, is that we're almost always physically located where MEPs are holding meetings. And mostly that means Brussels, of course. That also means Strasbourg for the plenary sessions. So I go to, well, all the interpreters, in fact, go to Strasbourg for a week every month. And I once worked out that over my career, if things continue as they're going, if things continue as one might expect, I'll have spent over 7 years in Strasbourg. So quite a significant portion of my career broken up into little chunks. And then obviously members also hold meetings elsewhere within Europe and outside, and where they go, generally interpreters go with them. Now, the other feature, I think, of the Parliament is that working as an interpreter for MEPs is very, very political. And MEPs they divide themselves into political groups in the Parliament, and these are based on their political views. So they go from far left all the way through the centre to the extreme right wing political groups, political parties. And as an interpreter, it's obviously quite important to know which political group a member who's speaking belongs to, because it can help you know, have some idea of what they might say, what their approach might be to a certain subject. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Ruben. Well, this is adding a whole other dimension as well to the nature of working as an interpreter for the institutions, the fast-paced, the very political nature of the work, and the traveling, going back and forth from Brussels to Strasbourg. It's all giving us a really good picture. Thank you. And perhaps then I'll move on straight away to our third panelist, Predrag Latinovic. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about interpreting at the Court of Justice?
Thank you very much, Catherine. Hi, everybody. My name is Predrag Latinovic. As Catherine said, I am an interpreter in the Slovenian booth at the Court of Justice. I've been here for the past 10.5 years, I think. Before that, I even had a translation background. I worked as a translator for European Parliament, among others. Also worked as a translator and interpreter in the Slovenian civil service. But now, currently, I'm at the court. As Catherine said, we are based in Luxembourg. And the court, as the name itself says, is the judicial authority of the European Union. So what we do is we protect EU law. Or in other words, we actually try to ensure that EU law is interpreted and applied correctly throughout the European Union. This is done in various ways. We either review the legality of acts which were adopted by the other institutions, such as the European Commission or the European Parliament, or we ensure that the member states comply with the obligations which arise from the treaties and other legislation from the European Union. And one of the biggest jobs that we have is to interpret EU law when requested to do so by the national courts and tribunals. Just to simplify it, if, for example, anywhere between Sweden or Slovakia, there is a judge in a village or a city who has to deal with a certain case, however minor or insignificant it may seem at first sight, and there is an aspect of the European Union, of EU law, which is involved and which is not clear, that judge has the right to send the question here to Luxembourg, to the EU Court of Justice. And when this legal aspect is regulated or dealt with, resolved, this interpretation, which is given by our court, then applies not only to that particular case or that particular court, but it applies to every single case of that kind in the European Union. So this is basically what we do. We are a small service. Interpretation service is a rather small compared to our colleagues from the Parliament and the Commission. We are 70 people in total for all the languages, all the booths, and we mostly interpret court hearings. So there's a court hearing in a courtroom, lawyers, judges, and us in the booths. And we also, for most of the time, I believe almost exclusively do the simultaneous interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Predrag, and thank you to all the panelists then for that really interesting introduction. As you can see from Predrag's description of the court interpreting service, it is a much smaller service and it's specialized in legal matters, although that can cover, as you said, really quite day-to-day things that we all experience, which end up being discussed when someone is not happy with a court decision somewhere in Europe. So it's very much relevant to all our lives as well. So fantastic introductions. I hope it's given all the participants a sense of who we are. And now, without further ado, I would like to ask you a couple of questions. I'd like to ask the panel to tell us what we've come here to talk about, which is, what's it like now? What is our job like now since COVID? So everybody's been affected by the pandemic, haven't they? There isn't anybody in the world really who hasn't been affected at all, and interpreters are no exception, and the interpreting profession is no exception. But I'd like to ask our panel to talk about what's changed. So what was it like before and what is it like now? What would you say in your service, in your experience, are the changes? So let's see, shall I ask Ruben to start this one? Would you like to start?
Yeah, I can do. I mean, it's quite a big question. I mean, a lot's changed and a lot's remained the same. I was actually thinking about this panel the other day while sitting in the booth. and my first thought, was actually nothing's changed. I'm still sitting in a booth. I'm still interpreting in the particular meeting where I was. Everyone was sitting in the meeting room, and I thought, well, this is back to I wouldn't say back to the past, but this is back to normality, as it were, because the pandemic period obviously wasn't particularly normal for any of us. I don't think at all. The most obvious physical manifestation of the change, I think, in the European Parliament is that we still have the plexiglass dividers that were put in the booths. During the pandemic, initially at the beginning of the pandemic, we worked one interpreter per booth. Normally there are 2 or 3, depending on the length of the meeting and how many languages there are in the meeting. So for a long time, for a significant period, there was one interpreter per booth, and then later on, we were able to have 2 interpreters per booth, depending on various technical features, separated by a plexiglass barrier. And those plexiglass barriers are still there, even though we're 2 or 3 in the booth, presumably in case there's another outbreak. Now, I think the other main difference, which I think is going to be a basis for a lot of what we say, is that prior to the pandemic, almost all participants were physically located in the meeting rooms. There were occasions when people connected remotely, but they were the exception rather than the rule, and they were dealt with on an ad hoc basis. I mean, and obviously sound quality is again something that we're going to discuss, but they were dealt with someone connected via whichever technology they used back then, Skype or something, and they were interpreted or not, depending on the sound quality. Now, although we're essentially in the European Parliament back to having participants located physically located in meeting rooms, I think there's a very small percentage overall of connections that take place remotely. There's a much more structured way of dealing with it, which is something that I can go into now or later on. Perhaps I'll leave it for a little bit later on, because the other one thing I'd mention actually that's different is that there seems to be a lot less rushing around from the point of view of the interpreters. In pre-pandemic, if there was a technical issue, or someone was speaking too fast, or someone wanted to go and get some documents that had suddenly appeared in the meeting room, there'd be lots of interpreters rushing out of the booth, knocking on the technician's door, going to see the team leader, the interpreting team leader. We always have a leader of the interpreting team, who is generally the interface between the interpreters and the meeting organisers. And so they'd be like the team leader. If they had something to say, for example, the meeting's going to run over, then they'd have to go and knock on every single booth and tell all the interpreters individually. Whereas now we communicate via a chat tool, essentially. It's called the Team Leader Communication Tool. And it includes that the technicians are linked in as our staff in the meeting room, the meeting organisers. And so we communicate directly via a chat system, which obviously saves a lot of rushing around.
That's fascinating, Ruben, and thank you so much for that initial description of life before and after the pandemic in the European Parliament. I would like to come back to some of those things you've mentioned. So at the moment, I think I'll collect some impressions from the other panelists, and then we'll come back and see which areas to go into and see if we have any questions about that as well. So perhaps, Jenny, shall I turn to you next and ask you to tell us what it's been like for you since the pandemic?
Yes, thank you very much. I was very interested to hear from Ruben that you still have the plexiglass in the booths in Parliament, because we did have plexiglass in booths in various meeting rooms at SCIC, but as far as I'm aware, they have now all been taken down again. I presume they're in storage somewhere and could easily be put up again quickly should there be another, wave of the pandemic, which we all hope there won't be. But we've now gone back to working in booths without the plexiglass dividers, and all sharing a booth again. So that, I think, for me was a huge relief, that the being separated from your colleagues was not a lasting sort of effect of the pandemic. I found that to be particularly challenging during the pandemic, when you weren't able to work together in the same space with your booth mates. And of course we have technological, possibilities, WhatsApp groups or emails, but it's not the same as being able to just sort of physically be there to support your colleague, just with a handwritten note, if need be. So I am glad that that has gone back to the way it was before the pandemic. I'd say the one big thing that has changed since the pandemic is that we now, in addition to the two traditional modes of interpreting, simultaneous and consecutive, have this third mode of interpreting that we can offer, essentially sort of a third product that we can offer to our customers, the Commission Directorates General that use our services, and that is to have a hybrid or fully online meeting. I wouldn't say that the proportion of these meetings is terribly high at the Commission. It probably makes up about 20–25% maybe of our overall output, and a lot of the meetings that are hybrid still see a lot of participants in the meeting room, but there is now this possibility for people to join in meetings remotely that we didn't really have before the pandemic. As Ruben said, there was always the possibility of someone, sending in a video or joining via video link, but that was always seen as something, quite exceptional and governed by specific rules and not something we would do as part of our day-to-day work. Whereas now, offering a scenario where participants can join in a meeting remotely is part of our sort of offer that we can provide. And it is being taken up particularly by the Commission Directorates General, where people used to have to travel to Brussels from all over Europe for a half-day meeting or for a full-day meeting, and now if they can join that same meeting online, it does save a lot of travel time and has all the advantages in terms of the environmental impact and the time saving and the money saving that can be quite advantageous. So I think that would be the main change, is this sort of additional new mode of interpreting that we can now offer. And of course there are some challenges that come along with that, but we'll be getting into that in a bit, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay, Jenny, then that's really interesting too. Can I just ask the participants if they want to put in the chat, are they surprised that quite a lot of meetings are still, or really a majority of meetings in the EU, from what we've heard so far, are taking place with physical presence of nearly all the participants? I think Ruben was saying in the Parliament, you still get the impression, oh, it's more or less the same. People are still going to meetings, and Jenny's saying that only 20–25% of meetings are even hybrid. So it'd be interesting to know if you're surprised about that. As we go on with the discussion, I'll look forward to your reactions. Perhaps I can turn to Predrag then and ask about your experiences before and after the pandemic at the court.
Thank you very much. Well, the experience is, roughly speaking, similar to the one of the other two institutions. We have introduced this new dimension, this new mode, I would say, as Jenny said, the remote dimension, let's say, because before we didn't have that. Before, at the court, everything was done in Luxembourg, in the court premises. So the judges were there, the lawyers were there, and all the interpreters were there. So everything, we didn't even have the possibility of any remote participation whatsoever. Now, then there was this big shock with COVID and travel restrictions and everything. So things were moved to remote participation. The parties started participating remotely, so we had to introduce all the system to do that. We didn't have plexiglass, unfortunately, because our booths, the design of our booths apparently did not permit that. But we had this system of one interpreter per booth, which also had effect on cooperation and participation between colleagues. Fast forward to now, I think that we are, as Ruben said, back to normality, I would say. The court allows for a remote presence only in exceptional or duly justified cases. So now, for the time being, the court itself prefers physical presence at the premises. I also think that the lawyers prefer to be here because there is a certain level of prestige of being able to plead in person before the Court of Justice. You always have people here taking photos in front of the building or in front of the flag. So people like to come here. And now remote participation is more an exception than a rule, and we have very few remote participation sessions in general. During COVID times, we had dozens of remote meetings per month. I think we had one this week, and that was the only one in the past month and a half, if I'm not mistaken. So we are back to normality, as Ruben said.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Predrag. That's given us a complete picture. That's really helpful. Now, I'm aware of the time that we have. We have a limited time today, so I want to zoom in now on a couple of things that you've touched on, but that are most important. It's yes, about the new things, the hybrid, the way you've talked about how there are now online meetings, there is online participation. How is it done, and how does it affect us as interpreters? So that's partly about I don't think we want too much technical detail about how these cloud services or whatever work, but what about us as interpreters? How have we prepared and adapted ourselves to the new situation? Can I ask you, Jenny, to talk about that, how this new meeting etiquette is managed and how interpreters find it?
Absolutely. One thing perhaps to just clarify from the get-go on this is that at SCIC, we were never in a situation where we were, as interpreters, were expected to work from home or from, an environment other than the booth. So even when I'm talking about remote meetings or hybrid meetings, we as the interpreters still go to the meeting rooms and sit in the booths. The main difference being that the participants aren't all in the room. And SCIC has done a lot of work to encourage or to try and find out what the optimal setup is for these types of meetings. And we have found that it does help if you have a certain number of key players in the room. That is someone whom we call the meeting manager, so the person in the meeting who is responsible for managing the platform, for helping participants with their connections, monitoring the chat, making sure that everyone who has connected or was supposed to connect has been able to connect, share any screens or provide that kind of technical support. Mostly for the participants, it's good if they can be in the meeting room, because then the head of the interpreting team and that person can liaise much more easily. It's also important to have a technical operator on site, so someone who is responsible for the less of the user interface technical support, but more of the back office technical support to make sure everything's running the way it should, that our consoles are connecting up to the meeting in the way they should, and that everything is running smoothly from that point of view, the link essentially between the meeting platform and the meeting room, to make sure that runs seamlessly. It's also important to have that person, the technical operator, on site. And we've also found it to be very helpful if at least the person who's chairing the meeting can be in the meeting room as well, because often as interpreters you have certain messages you need to relay to the meeting chair, you need to ask them for information and have exchanges with them, and it can be helpful if they are in the room as well. And as long as those key players are in the room, things can generally work very well. I think these remote meetings place more work on the shoulders of the head of the interpreting team, because they have more people, to liaise with. They also tend to log on to the remote interpreting platform to be able to see what's being talked about in the chat and pass on any useful information to the team, or conversely, if there's any important information from the team, to share that with meeting participants. And after that, it all depends on the quality of the connections of meeting participants joining remotely. In cases where meeting participants connect from a suitable environment with a good microphone and a stable internet connection, it can work extremely well. And then there are always, unfortunately, however, those cases where meeting participants don't have a stable connection or don't have the right kind of hardware, or are connecting from their car or from the local cafe or from their garden because it's nice weather. And that can be a real challenge for us as interpreters, because the sound quality simply isn't good enough. And often the meeting participants on the chat will say, oh, but I can hear them just fine. But it doesn't mean that we're going to be able to interpret them just fine, because our own voices while we interpret is masking the already poor sound coming in. So that, I think, is the main, now that we've sort of more or less stabilized, I think, the technical setup on our end, the main thing we need to keep doing is raising awareness among meeting participants about what that good meeting etiquette is, which I think applies not only to meetings, multilingual meetings with interpretation, but to video conferencing in general, really.
Yeah, very interesting, Jenny, very interesting. And good to know that it's sort of stabilized in a way. But what about, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, yes, you know, that's more duties, different duties for us, perhaps, as interpreters. So our own role is evolving to some extent. And perhaps I can link up and come back to you, Ruben, and ask about, you know, what about the effects on us as well of doing all this, of people dialing in from places where perhaps the sound isn't very good. Would you like to talk about that, Ruben, and just say a few words about our own interpreters' own ears and how we work and how that's affecting, how we're affected by these changes?
Well, I certainly can. I mean, I certainly can. I mean, obviously there is a concern, and not only among interpreters, that this the potentially bad sound could have a detrimental effect on our hearing. I think that's the main concern. I think there's a clear awareness that trying to interpret from inferior sound requires an increased cognitive load, or produces an increased cognitive load. So your brain has to work a lot harder to do that, to try and make out, to try and understand. And obviously you're speaking at the same time, which makes it more difficult. I mean, as Jenny said, that's often the issue arises that the interpreters can't work from a specific feed for whatever reason. And the meeting participants say, well, we can hear it perfectly well. What's the problem? And the reason is this increased cognitive load that interpreters suffer in trying to understand the message and then obviously get the message across in their native language. So I think this is a concern. What's being done about it? I mean, the first thing is that in the Parliament, anyway, there's just a lot more, a general awareness raising of the importance of good sound. So the importance of having a good microphone. In the Parliament, for example, there are microphones being sent out to MEPs and also, I think, to external speakers. I think there's a project to do that as well. I don't know whether it's started yet, to ensure that they have the right equipment in order to be able to produce the best possible sound. There's also awareness of not connecting from your car or from the garden or from somewhere where there's a barking dog or a crying baby. I mean, a crying baby can be very sweet in a meeting and can look very nice, but obviously it's not ideal for interpreters.
Ruben, can I just interrupt you? I'm so sorry, but I just want to interrupt you there because there's a question come in from Vera. Thank you very much for your question. And it's about, it says, do you see the participants in a remote simultaneous meeting? So would you just like to answer that?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. I mean, earlier you used the phrase a new meeting etiquette, I think, Catherine. And so the etiquette involves using an appropriate equipment. It involves not connecting from your car or from wherever, but it also involves switching on your camera. And that's been made a condition. It's not directly to do with sound quality, but obviously being able to see someone, being able to see them, their lips move, being able to move, being able to see their gestures, is very helpful when you're trying to understand what someone's saying. And so in the Parliament, we don't interpret people who don't switch their camera on. We have to have a good, clear picture of their face with appropriate light so that we can see them properly. And that's part, I think, of the meeting etiquette. So the answer to the question is yes, we do see people who are connecting remotely.
Yes.
Would you like me to continue with other measures, or?
Let me just pause you on that, if I may, because I just want to mention that officially our webinar will come to a close in a couple of minutes, but I just want to tell the audience that we are happy to continue for 10 to 15 more minutes if anyone still wants to continue the discussion. So we are going to stay here. The webinar will stay open until then. So let's resume then. And I would just like to ask Predrag to come in and tell us a bit about that question of the interpreters. And you mentioned that during the pandemic at the Court of Justice, we were sitting alone in the booths. And now we're back together, and you talked about cooperation and so on. How do you think things have evolved in terms of the interpreters and their approach to work day to day over that time? That's quite a broad question, I know, but I want to invite you to just say something about that.
It is quite broad, but it's very useful too. So thank you for that question, because I think that we have gained some experience in this remote dimension that we didn't have before. So we kind of learned how to deal with this. It took a lot of work. Every institution had to establish its own system. As you know, we are colleagues, so we work for the same institution. So we had to establish an entire system. We have something that's similar to what Jenny explained in the commission. So we also have a system of validation of remote sites. So not anyone can join remotely and appear before the court. They have to meet some criteria of video and audio quality. We did have issues with sound quality, especially because inherently it can be worse than it is from what you get from the microphones at the court. So we had to put a lot of work in that, especially, as Jenny said, awareness raising was important, because it was very hard sometimes to explain to people that it is not the same thing if you're at a meeting and if you just listen to the meeting, than if you're an interpreter who has to hear, understand, translate in their head, and then have an output in another language, and then control that output just in order to avoid any slip of the tongue. So so we did gain a lot of experience. We know what we're dealing with now. Some of our colleagues, or most of our colleagues, are also trained, because we also introduced these roles of liaison officers between the interpreting team and the technical team, and the judges and lawyers, in case anything goes wrong during this remote setting. But for the time being, I think we're doing well. We also took measures to adapt the workload of anyone who has an overload of remote meetings or interpreting sessions. So so we are doing our best to adapt, but we are trying hard to adapt to this new setting, because, as Ruben rightly said, it adds a layer of difficulty, because if the sound is not optimum, if video quality, but especially sound quality, is not good, then we have to work more. Because, as one colleague at the court rightly said, and I think that's a very good quote, he said, any lack of quality in sound is compensated by the interpreter. So if we have a worse sound, we cannot provide a worse interpretation. That's very important to say, because even if you have a much worse sound, your output has to be as best as possible. So the person to compensate that is the interpreter, and that adds another layer to the entire process. So if I may use a metaphor, you're juggling with 3 or 4 balls, and then there's another ball coming in, and then you just have to juggle with it. So it makes the job a bit more difficult sometimes. If everything's well, if the quality is good, then there's no problem. But we are adapting to it.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good, really interesting answer that fleshes out what we're saying here. And that makes me want to come back to Ruben now. And I'm sorry I cut you off in mid-flow before, but I think you were going to go on to say, you know, what some of the institutions are doing to, you know, alleviate some of these problems. So perhaps I'll ask you first, then, and then I'll ask Jenny to answer that question fairly briefly, if we can, so we can start to sort of draw the threads together.
Well, thank you. As I was saying, I think to alleviate the problem in the immediate term, I mean, there's this sending out of microphones to speakers to try and improve the sound quality. There are recommendations on speaker etiquette, essentially, so the way they should connect, etc. Prior to a meeting with people speaking remotely. There are technical staff who are available, and they get in touch with the speakers and connect and ensure that their connection is as optimal as possible. They help them with any technical problems. So these are all kind of immediate efforts to improve the sound quality of the specific speaker. Apart from that, there's a lot of awareness raising that goes on. to make sure that MEPs are aware. I can't remember if I said that. Maybe I said that already. To make sure MEPs are aware and speakers are aware of how important it is for the interpretation, but also not just for interpreters. Let's not forget. I mean, we're only interpreting to get the speaker's message across. So it's not really about us. It's about the message that the speaker wants to get across. And there's a certain, I mean, if someone's connecting from the garden or from a car or with a pet in their arms, it's not really perhaps appropriate for a formal meeting. And so it affects the image of the speaker as well. It's not only about interpreters. Other longer term things, that there are health studies being carried out, I think, or that have been launched specifically on interpreter health when exposed to remote sound. And in the Parliament, there are also limits on how much remote sound you can be exposed to per day and per week, if I'm not mistaken. And if you cross those thresholds, then you're given some rest time, an amount of rest time the next week, so that essentially so that you can recover from this increased burden essentially on your brain.
Very good, very interesting answer. And Jenny, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I'd say that really SCIC's taking a sort of similar approach to Parliament, really. The limitation to the number of remote meetings. We don't have a limit on sort of how many minutes of remote speaking time where we can interpret, but we do have a cap on the number of meetings in a given week that can be with online participation. And when we do interpret in those meetings, our working hours are also shorter. So when in a normal, in-person meeting, you might be spending 8 hours, in the booth with a lunch break. Of course, that is limited to 4 or 6 hours on a remote or hybrid meeting, depending on how many of you there are per booth. So there's been that sort of approach of limiting the exposure of interpreters and also the awareness raising approach. SCIC just in October published its latest code of conduct and disclaimer. So again, interpreting will not be provided in certain situations. Ruben already mentioned when there's no video. That is now something we've introduced at SCIC as well. And if meeting participants aren't connecting from a suitable environment, or if the sound is not good enough. And in the code of conduct that is provided to all participants taking part in these kinds of remote or hybrid meetings, we raise awareness of the right equipment to use. Unfortunately, we're still far too often seeing people connecting with, iPhone AirBuds or whatever they're called, and earphones with little integrated microphones that are up here somewhere that just cannot pick up the sound in sufficient quality. So that sort of awareness raising. And then the aspect of cognitive load and auditory health as well that Ruben mentioned. I think SCIC is open. We know that in the interpreting community, there is concern by a lot of colleagues about the impact on our auditory health of interpreting these remote meetings. And because we haven't been doing it for very long, we don't really understand the impact it's having on us. But we do know that there are, people out there in IEC and in other, the International Conference Interpreters Association and other bodies sort of looking to carry out studies on this. Ruben mentioned studies at the Parliament as well. And I think SCIC is certainly open to, taking on board any new findings in that regard as and when they become available.
That's very interesting. Yeah, Ruben, you wanted to come back. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, apologies. There are a couple of things that I forgot to mention that actually I think are quite interesting. The first thing is that in the Parliament, an interpreter has an individual right to switch off, so not to interpret someone who's when the sound quality is not good enough. And obviously you have to say why you can't interpret that particular speaker, and it has to be something to do with sound quality. I mean, you can't say, well, I don't like this speaker, I'm not going to interpret them or whatever. But so you do have this individual right to switch off. Now that obviously can lead to problems when, for example, the meeting participants see that, say, 3 booths have switched off and 5 are still working, and the meeting participants say, well, why why has my language switched off while I see the other languages are still being provided? And so to try and avoid the problem as much as possible, there's been, firstly, there are efforts for the team leader to give a recommendation. So to listen to the speaker and as quickly as possible over this team leader communication tool I mentioned earlier, to say, yes, the sound is good enough. No, the sound is not good enough. It's a recommendation. It's not an order. It's not a hierarchical team leader who is above anyone else in the hierarchy, but it's a recommendation which colleagues can then follow or not follow. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is that there's an IT tool. Now, I'm not a technical expert by any means, so I have no idea how this works, but the idea is that you have an IT tool which checks the sound quality. So presumably whether it's between certain decibels, I think it's measured in, or so, my technical knowledge is minimal. But and what it does is it's green if the sound is okay according to the tool. That doesn't mean it's okay for the interpreters, but it's okay according to the tool. And you obviously, as an interpreter, still can switch off even if the tool says it's green. But more usefully, perhaps, if the sound quality isn't good enough, it turns red. And that is then communicated to the interpreting team as quickly as possible, hopefully quickly enough. And at that point, if it's read, the recommendation from this computer tool, this is not to interpret, and to try and ensure some consistency across the team. So just a couple of things that I realized I hadn't mentioned that might be interesting.
That's very, very interesting. And I don't think you'd get that information anywhere else other than on this wonderful panel, because there you are living all these amazing changes day to day. And I do hope we still have some members of the audience with us. But having said that, it is almost 2:30 now. So I think I ought to, unless any of you want to make any burning point before I draw the threads together, just wave if you do. But I would say, just to try and conclude, would be this webinar would be that it seems to me that oh yes, Predrag, you want to make a point.
It's a very short point. Thank you. I just wanted to say, as Jenny mentioned, we're not just doing this for our own sakes. Yes, everybody would like to, protect their own conditions of work or to make them as best as possible. But we also do it for our clients, because even at the court, well, we have these tests for everyone who wants to participate remotely, and we try to stress that as much as possible. For example, personally, I was in contact with Slovenian lawyers, and if they speak Slovenian, there's a high probability that none of the other judges speaks that language. So if they plead in Slovenian, the success of their message depends on the work that the interpreters provide. And in order to do that, we need the best possible conditions. So yes, we're not doing that just for our sakes. It is very important for us to be able to provide the best possible service for our clients too.
Yes, I think that's a message that's come across loud and clear in this discussion, and I'm really glad to hear it. And that's how I feel about it too, if I'm allowed to say my own view as the moderator. But I feel that interpreters always do want to do that core activity as best they can. They want to get that message across absolutely 100% if they can. And so we want to be able to use all the tools, don't we, in a way that helps that to happen. So perhaps on that note would be a nice positive way of concluding and saying, I've realized, just how many changes there have been over the last few years, partly because of the pandemic, partly because of the advance of technology. But I think also, I hope you can agree with me. I hope you'll just nod and say, it's still brain, ears, mouth, and pencil that are still very, very much the center of what we do every day. And if anybody here is studying interpreting, please carry on with that, because that will still be what will be your success in the future as an interpreter, if you can do it. So thank you very much, everyone. I think now, just before we close, there's going to be an information page, which I think our colleague is going to put on the screen now. Other than that, I want to thank the panelists very much indeed for all their wonderful contributions. And I thank the audience as well for all your comments and questions. So Ryan, do you want to say anything, or are you just putting that page up now? I think that's self-explanatory, isn't it? So that's the contact information for our social media, and you can scan the QR code as well for more information. So I think at that point, we now bring the panel to a close. Okay, so I think that's all. and have a good afternoon and enjoy the rest of the London Language Show. We have a question saying that you can't see someone can't see the page, the information page. I'm not sure what we do about that.
I'm not sure either. I can certainly see it.
I can see it, yes.
I could also just, maybe there was one more question in the chat I can very quickly reply to, and it had to
Yes.
do with whether or not the participants can see us when we're interpreting remotely.
I see.
And the answer to that would be no, unless they are in the meeting room and they can look up to the booths and see us working there. But if they're connecting online, they wouldn't get to see the interpreters.
That's great. Thank you very much for doing that, Jenny. That's excellent. So I think now the participant can see the information page, so that's excellent. So thank you very much.